North Korea just sent thousands of troops to Ukraine's front lines. With Russia suffering massive losses, over 670,000 soldiers dead or injured, Putin is desperate for reinforcements. Enter North Korea, stepping in with up to 10,000 troops to back up Russian forces. Reports from South Korean intelligence suggest that these soldiers are already fighting alongside Russians. Ukraine's war against Russia may now be a battle against two countries. But why is North Korea doing this? And will it really make a difference? Let's dig into what this means for the war and what might happen next. Let's start with the reports of North Korean troops in Russia. The October 15th report by South Korean intelligence is bolstered by Ukrainian intelligence, though there is some discrepancy in the numbers. Some reports indicate that the number of North Korean troops sent is only 3,000, while others imply a larger figure of 10,000. What's even more concerning is that that might not be the full extent of direct military assistance that North Korea has sent in terms of troops. The actual number of North Koreans could very well be higher. Russian media and sources from the Kremlin have fervently denied any claims that North Korea is directly involved in the fighting on the front lines. A spokesman for the Kremlin suggested that the reports by South Korea and Ukraine were hoaxes or ungrounded rumors intended to cast Russia in yet another bad light. However, the same spokesperson suggested that North Korea is a close neighbor and that the two nations are developing relations in all areas. But how far do these relations go, and do they support the reports of North Korean troops in Russia? The actual alliance between Russia and North Korea goes back decades. One of the most notable such unions was Russia, or the Soviet Union at the time, allying itself with North Korea during the Korean War in the 1950s. Since then, the Soviet Union and its inheritor Russia have supported North Korea's economy and military. In fact, some North Korean military designs clearly trace their roots to Soviet weaponry. However, the North Korean involvement in the current war in Ukraine can be explained with much more recent announcements. One of those is a comprehensive strategic partnership treaty between the two nations, signed in June 2024, in which the two countries vowed to come to the other's aid if either's territory is threatened by a third party. The wording of the declaration is suspiciously close to the famous Article 5 of the NATO alliance, which requires all members to defend each other against non-member nations. Considering the implications of Russia now creating its own version of NATO, with autocratic nations like North Korea, the West is concerned about just how deep this alliance goes. And the West does have some reasons to be concerned. It turns out that the military aid from North Korea to Russia goes far beyond mere troops. Reports from as early as February 2024 suggest that North Korea has sent over 13,000 containers of artillery rounds to Russia since August 2023. This implies that North Korea has been helping Russia at least indirectly for over a year now. Additionally, the suspected containers were estimated to contain more than 3 million 122mm artillery shells or more than 500,000 152mm shells. Since the report couldn't be clear on the exact type of artillery rounds being sent, and Russia itself was a significant domestic producer of the same types of rounds, the actual number and type of rounds are likely a mix of the two. In return, Russia has been sending food and agriculture supplies to North Korea, helping stabilize food prices in the country. But more importantly, food shipments to a country that has a fraction of Russia's population isn't that much of a burden for Russia, and yet gives them access to a resource they might need in the future: manpower. You see, despite its lack of military technology, geopolitical pressure, and influence in the world, North Korea is a heavily militarized nation. Its total population is only around 26 million people, yet there are estimates that it has a whopping 1.3 million active military service members. This is due to the country having some of the strictest mandatory service requirements in the world. North Korean men stay in the military for 8 years, which used to be 10, and women stay for 5 years. According to some estimates, in the event of war, North Korea can mobilize roughly 7.5 million people, more than a quarter of its total population. Sure, that might not mean much when you consider that North Korea technically hasn't been in a war since the mid-20th century. Additionally, the country's military technology is thought to be at a relatively low level compared to Western countries, particularly NATO members. And yet the mention of North Korea allying itself with Russia is still making NATO wary. Let's focus a bit more on that previous notion. The North Korean military doesn't have a particularly high level of experience and technology, but North Korea has been sending military equipment to Russia for more than a year now. Additionally, there are reports that North Korea has also sent its military engineers to oversee and operate the equipment that North Korea can use in its own military. North Korea has also attempted at least 41 missile launches in 2023. The US State Department estimates that the North Korean military budget is paltry compared to its neighbors, at only $4 billion annually. However, the country's conventional military capabilities still include roughly 4,000 tanks, 476 combat-capable aircraft, and 5,500 multiple rocket launchers, among other vehicles. When you combine all of these, it's clear that while the Korean military is using outdated equipment, it has ambitious plans to create an army that can stand on its own, especially against its southern neighbor. But why does the part about North Korea sending engineers matter? Well, the war in Ukraine has become a hotbed for experimentation of how new and old technologies mesh together. Specifically, both Ukraine and Russia started with relatively modern weapons and equipment. However, as the war dragged on, both countries developed their strategies in two directions. First, the nations resorted to using their older, obsolete vehicles, such as the T-64 and T-72 tanks, or old towed artillery pieces. In some cases, the weapons that could be seen on the battlefield were the same ones that were used during World War II. On the other hand, Russia has also had opportunities to modernize its equipment, considering it's one of the largest militaries in the world with close ties to China. To that end, modern T-90M tanks and MiG-35 fighter jets were considered the pinnacles of Russian military technology. But the real kicker in the Russian military was artillery pieces. Russia has the world's largest arsenal of towed and self-propelled artillery, although they've lost close to 19,000 of these weapons throughout the war. The advancements in Russian artillery were so high that the most modern self-propelled launcher, Tu-S-19, could fire roughly 10 rounds per minute. This far outstrips the capabilities of Western artillery. Even older Russian artillery was considered among the most capable in its generation. So in addition to their ability to manufacture more artillery shells than any other country in the world, North Korea is using its own industry to boost those numbers. The result is a staggering onslaught caused by Russia's artillery, which was one of the main reasons Ukraine was hard-pressed to launch counteroffensives in Donbass. Russia's ability to set up a defensive line of artillery and use its numbers advantage to press forward made a lack of modern tanks relatively unimportant. But Ukraine also received relatively modern weapons and vehicles as donations from NATO. Among these are the vital Patriot air defense systems, M1 Abrams tanks, M2 Bradleys, and CV-90 infantry support vehicles, and even F-16 fighter jets that could directly counter the numerous Russian MiG-29 jets. Throughout all that, the presence of North Korean engineers and military officers on the Russian side of the battlefield becomes a little clear. These men and women can soak in real-world experience about which weapons are working on the battlefield and which aren't. Furthermore, North Korea has also been sending its own long-range missiles for Russia to use. One of its chief weapons is the KN-23 missile, with a maximum range of roughly 400 to 430 miles. By operating the missiles in real missions, the engineers can get vital data points on why their tests keep failing. More importantly, the experience gained from each launch will possibly allow North Korea to manufacture better missiles moving forward. However, North Korea's economy and geopolitical isolation means that any progress it makes on this front likely won't let it catch up to its neighbor. Let's consider the aforementioned KN-23s. Analysts suggest that roughly half of the missile tests that North Korea has conducted so far have failed, with missiles not reaching their intended targets. This means that currently the potential danger that these weapons pose is relatively low, especially given that both Russia and Ukraine have proven that layered anti-air defenses are consistent in dealing with that kind of threat. But if the missiles sent to Russia get tested enough in real-life situations and against more modern defensive measures, there's a small chance that the engineers can figure out what keeps going wrong with the launches and improve their chances of success. With Ukraine as the testing ground, however, even failed tests can pose a significant danger to Ukraine. A missile that only partially reaches its target is still likely to land somewhere in Ukraine, potentially causing severe collateral damage and civilian deaths. As a result, North Korea is basically using Russia as a proxy to test its own combat preparedness. A bulk of it is through determining its capacity for making artillery ammunition. Exporting facilities are working at full capacity, while domestic ones are only at 30%. Meanwhile, a larger part of it is making sure that North Korean weapons can be improved to have better odds of hitting their intended targets. But just how much are the added 10,000 soldiers from North Korea going to matter on the grand scale of the war in Ukraine? The answer is not that much. You have to remember that they are unlikely to be trained and experienced people. In fact, it's highly likely that their presence on the battlefield serves a completely different purpose to the one you might think. As mentioned, North Korea has an active military personnel of close to 1.3 million. That puts it around the same size as the US or Russia, if you believe the numbers the Kremlin or Russian analysts provide on the latter's military prowess. And Russia is estimated to have lost more than 670,000 soldiers who are either dead or too injured to return to military service. So 10,000 men from a country that can't train its soldiers on modern military tactics or perform international exercises are practically a drop in the bucket in terms of bodies being thrown to the war. In fact, data from September 2024 suggests that it was the deadliest month for Russia, with over 1,250 casualties daily, at least according to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. And it was the fifth consecutive month when the casualty count didn't drop below 1,200 for a day. Some analysts suggest that the Russian death toll is only going to get higher in the coming months. The reason for this is the approaching cold weather, where Ukrainians will have the advantage of fighting on their own land and weapons and vehicles that are better suited to fighting in snowy conditions. So when you consider how many soldiers Russia has lost and how many soldiers North Korea has, the implication is clear. The 10,000 troops are likely only the start of North Korea's deployments in Russia. Based on past statistics, those 10,000 men can theoretically be wiped out in slightly over a week if they get put anywhere close to the battlefield. This is also probably why the reports of sightings of North Korean troops are slightly vague, as there's no confirmation that they have actually been deployed to an active part of the front line. As such, it's highly likely that North Korea will send more troops to Russia, and possibly soon. Even if they need a few months of follow-up training before being deployed to the actual front lines, Russia can get yet another stockpile of soldiers ready to go to Ukraine. And it wouldn't be a moment too soon. That's because Russia's active military personnel counts can be highly misleading. While analysts suggest that Russia has 1.3 million active personnel, it's highly likely that a bulk of those are military conscripts serving mandatory one-year terms. These soldiers are in a similar state to the ones North Korea is sending. They are unlikely to be trained or well equipped to deal with Ukrainian tactics and more modern weapons. Worse yet, some interviews with prisoners of war from Kursk suggest that Russia has been skimping as much as possible on military training. Interviewees have said that some soldiers received as little as 2 weeks of training before being shipped to military posts to serve. And Russia can't even legally use its conscripts abroad. Technically, Putin could try to overthrow that decision and change the law. However, the ban on deploying conscripts abroad came about after the disastrous Soviet-Afghan War in the 1980s, which had a civilian death toll of several million and soldier casualties following close behind. Therefore, forcing conscripts to join the fighting in Ukraine, or at least publicly acknowledging it, would likely be extremely bad press for Putin. So he's forced to rely on contract soldiers and mercenaries for Russia's offensive campaigns. Meanwhile, on the other side, volunteer fighters from all over the world have registered to fight in the Ukrainian International Legion. But even with their contract soldiers and mercenaries, Russia's troop numbers are likely going to be much smaller than implied. According to a report by The Riddle, the Russian military has signed close to 500,000 contracts in 2023. However, the same report suggests that the army has significantly lowered the minimum duration spelled out in the contract. For prisoners who join the military to get a reduced sentence, the duration could be as low as 3 months. That means that a single person could have signed multiple contracts in a single year. Additionally, not all soldiers are going to renew their contracts after they expire, putting a further dent in Russia's active military numbers. The Riddle report implies that out of the indicated 500,000 contracts, only 180,000 of them are likely to stay active throughout 2024. Putin has stated that the upper age limit for military service has been increased to pump up the numbers. However, note that these will be conscripts for the first year of service, and thus unusable in Ukraine. That means that Russia would need to wait for those recruits to sign new contracts after mandatory service. All the while, Russia has been losing soldiers left and right. But luckily for them, North Korea has plenty of soldiers to go around, as well as missiles and artillery shells to send to Russia. And North Korea desperately needs funds, food, and military expertise, which are all things that Russia could feasibly provide. How are Russia and North Korea justifying these actions? The answer is related to the aforementioned military pact between the two nations and Ukraine's recent successes. In August, Ukraine managed to do what was previously unthinkable: go on the offensive. The pivotal incursion of Kursk was a 3-week-long military campaign that saw Ukraine occupy roughly 500 square miles of Russian territory. Russian conscripts and soldiers stationed in Kursk have either surrendered or retreated from the invading Ukrainian soldiers. The Kremlin's reply to the situation was sluggish. Russia failed to mount a significant defense against the incoming soldiers. It will be a month after the operation started that Russia finally announced a counteroffensive in the region. Even then, most recent reports from mid-October suggest that Russia has managed to get back only half of the occupied territory under its own control. The invasion of Kursk was a huge victory for Ukraine. It showed that Russia wasn't well prepared to fight in its own territory. But even more importantly, Putin's threats about using nuclear weapons should Russia get invaded turned out to be relatively harmless. It's allowed NATO to reconvene and suggest more aggressive measures of arming Ukraine. NATO's military chief stated that Ukraine could possibly use donated long-range missiles to perform precision strikes deeper into Russia's territory, something that the US forbade when sending their contribution of missiles. But it's the invasion of Kursk that is giving Putin the excuse for getting North Korea involved. With the military pact between the two countries signed before the invasion happened, Putin can claim that Russia's territorial integrity has been threatened. The pact can go into effect, allowing North Korea to send its own troops to Russia to help defend it against the Ukrainian army. Of course, the true purpose of why the soldiers are there is more likely because they boost the Russian numbers on the front line, far from Russian lands. After all, Russia has plenty of military conscripts that it can sacrifice to defend its own borders, but probably not enough contract soldiers to keep sending to Ukraine. So the North Koreans are likely to be added to the pile of dead Russia is amassing as part of its war efforts. There's a bit of a method to Putin's madness here. While Russia has suffered significant losses in Ukraine, the Ukrainian military isn't faring that much better. There's also the fact that Ukraine is smaller and a less populous country than Russia, so it has an even smaller supply of men to draw from. And North Korea will likely be happy to send more and more soldiers to Ukraine. After all, the country has mandatory military service that spans years, so it can quickly replenish its own supplies. The prestige and, more importantly, experience North Korea's military would gain from its field testing in Ukraine is likely going to give the country even more of a morale boost. This can create a positive feedback loop of North Korea sending a relatively unending stream of soldiers to Russia, all with the goal of giving them either valuable experience to fight a future war, likely against South Korea, or reducing the strain on the country's economy. The Ukrainian invasion of Kursk is perhaps the perfect opportunity for the North Korean army to get that experience. The Ukrainian military has a limited presence in the occupied territory. Also, technically, with North Korea being bound only to defend Russia, both countries could claim that the deployment of North Koreans in Kursk is only acknowledging and fulfilling the military pact they signed. Beyond giving Russia more soldiers to work with, deploying North Koreans to Kursk means that the Russian military won't have to divest a lot of its contract soldiers from the main front line in Donbass. It will allow Russia to keep up the tempo it has in the region and continuously pressure the Ukrainian military to stick to being to the defense. So as long as Ukraine is using its long-range capabilities to defend itself, it can't put too many resources into mounting precision strikes. Those precision strikes have so far targeted supply roads, stockpiles, and other vital military targets. However, Ukraine has also damaged or destroyed some oil refineries in the west of the country. This limits Russia's access to vital fuel for its war machine, literally. The country was forced to stop exporting diesel and gas to most other trading nations and has asked Kazakhstan to prepare a supply to send to Russia instead. Even more importantly, the lack of domestic supply and refining capacity means that Russia won't be able to export nearly as much oil and gas abroad. If Russia needs to start refining the crude oil and gas it would otherwise send to China and India, its biggest cash cow suddenly disappears. The oil and gas industry exports have been estimated to account for roughly 45% of Russia's federal budget. If those profits start dipping, Russia's economy is in big trouble. Remember, Russia's not getting these North Korean soldiers for free either. It's sending North Korea supplies and possibly money in return. If Russia's economy declines too much, even North Korea might not be able to continue supplying soldiers. But there's an even more important aspect of why Russia doesn't want Ukraine to keep launching long-range strikes. Ukraine has already started targeting Moscow. The drone attack on September 10th was among the largest offensive operations Ukraine has mounted since the beginning of the war. It sent over 140 drones, scattering them across Russia toward vital targets. 20 drones were shot down over the Moscow region by Russian anti-air defenses, but the attack still damaged a few buildings, killing at least one person, and caused widespread cancellation of air traffic surrounding the capital. For the bulk of the war, Moscow itself wasn't directly affected by the fighting. The Kremlin's propaganda machine worked in Putin's favor to pacify, sometimes forcefully, the large population centers. The conscription efforts were largely targeting the poorer areas of the country, often promising wages that were as much as 3 to 4 times higher than the national average. But when Moscow became a target, all of that stopped mattering. Putin's influence over Russia persists so long as the upper classes that reside in Moscow are kept safe. If Ukraine can manage to remove that sense of protection, with its ability to strike the Russian capital with long-range weapons, all bets are off. The same people who are keeping Putin in power can be the ones who depose him of it. And that's precisely why North Korean soldiers are important to Russia at the moment. They present Putin with an avenue to distract Ukraine for at least a little bit longer, giving Russia some breathing room to keep up the pressure in Donbass and determine the next best steps. But are the North Koreans up for the battle? Reports state that some North Korean soldiers have already abandoned their posts in Kursk and Bryansk. While there were only 18 soldiers who abandoned the war effort, it speaks of the fact that the soldiers themselves were likely being pressured to go to Russia, possibly under threats or penalties. North Korean soldiers might have realized that the war in Ukraine is far bloodier than they could ever imagine. It's said that some are even using the opportunity to try to defect from North Korea altogether. With the reports of defections coming mere days after the sighting of North Korean soldiers among the Russian military, it's obvious that Russia can't really use the North Korean soldiers to their full extent. First, there's the probable lack of military training. Secondly, the North Korean soldiers are unlikely to speak Russian, creating a near insurmountable language barrier. This lack of cohesiveness between Russian and North Korean troops probably means that Ukraine won't have significant problems dealing with the first batch of 10,000 soldiers. They're likely going to fall apart faster than Russian conscripts, and they might not even get deployed to the front line in Ukraine to boot. But what about the next batch or the one after that? If Russia sees North Korean soldiers as an opportunity to throw something other than its own men into the meat grinder to save face, it's most likely going to take it. The fact that the North Korean soldiers aren't able to function as well as Russian troops won't really matter to Putin. They'd only be there to prevent Russia from losing more experienced soldiers or to soak up bullets in the hope that Ukraine is starting to run dry. This would mean that North Korea might be the catalyst for Russia being able to extend the war for at least a few years, and that's a dangerous prospect for Ukraine for one simple reason. The US is holding its presidential elections in November, and former President Donald Trump's odds of being re-elected are relatively high. Trump has been pretty vocal about trying to maintain a closer relationship with Russia than current President Joe Biden's administration ever was. Furthermore, he's stated that the US isn't getting as much out of NATO as it's providing to the alliance. While there's no precedent for it, Trump winning the election and getting inaugurated next year could mean the slow start of NATO losing its largest economic and military equipment supplier. If Trump maintains the same sentiment about sending donations to Ukraine, then Ukraine might be needing to finish the war sooner rather than later. And if North Korea's troops prove to be at least partially effective at prolonging the war, there's no telling how the tide of the conflict can change. But what do you think? Are the North Korean soldiers going to make a difference in Ukraine? Or is this all just a part of Russia's posturing that it still has a chance to win the war? Thank you for watching, and leave your comments below.